Welcome everyone who has joined us. We are moving on in our coverage of aquatic invasive species this morning. And the next session is recognizing aquatic invasive animals and plants. We will first hear from Paul Skawinski, who is a Wisconsin Citizen Lake Monitoring Network educator from Extension Lakes. And Paul will be presenting on invasive submerged aquatic plants, who's who. And then right after that, we'll go into hearing from Peggy Compton, the program manager for Water Action Volunteers, who will present Meet Wisconsin's Aquatic Invasive Animals. And then finally, we'll be joined by Pearce, the Wisconsin First Detector Network coordinator, who will share on what's that upland-ish plant. Together, they'll have about 45 minutes for their presentations, and then we'll be able to answer your questions. So if you have questions for Paul, Peggy, or Ann, please post them into the Q&A box. If you put them in the chat box, the presenters won't be able to see them. So put them into the Q&A box, and if you can, write the name of the speaker that you'd like the question to be posed to. Is it for Paul? Is it for Peggy? Is it for Ann? And upvote any questions you see that you want to see answered. So with that, I'm going to hand the stage over to Paul.
All right, thanks, Joe. My goal here with this presentation is to run through a small set of invasive submergent and floating aquatic plants, a couple of which are fairly common in Wisconsin, and then a bunch of them that are not common by any means, but we have repeatedly found them here, and it seems like they may be just knocking on the door. So I'm hoping that everybody watching will just get some mental images in their mind of these different plants. And if they do find them on the landscape at some point in the future, then you might think back to that presentation you saw at some point that you saw a picture of this plant, and maybe you should have it looked at by an expert for verification of the ID of this species. So that's what I'm hoping for today. The first one I'll talk about is Eurasian water milfoil. We've been talking about this one plenty. It's been around for about 60 years here in Wisconsin. It's found in at least 864 lakes and streams here. There's probably a few dozen more that are undocumented right now. We just haven't found them yet. It's a great example of why early detection is so important across all of these species. We really want to find these when they are causing the least amount of ecological damage and would cause the least need for financial investment and would be the easiest to control. So we like to find things as early as possible to make the management as easy and effective as possible as well. This plant does sometimes form pretty dense mats on the surface of the water. It can interfere with all kinds of recreation in that case. It's hard to boat through or fish in a mat like you see on the lower photo there. And it does spread by fragmentation. So any little piece that breaks off from a propeller or other turbulence in the water can start a new plant and spread it around a lake or between lakes. So the milfoils as a group, we have 8 of them in Wisconsin. One of them does not follow this rule, but the other 7 have these very feathery leaves like this. All the common species that you're likely to see will have this kind of a leaf pattern to them. Typically 4 leaves around the stem in a whorl or a ring, and each leaf is divided very extensively into these tiny leaflets. And one of the ways to tell the species apart is by counting the number of leaflet pairs on an individual leaf. So if you counted those leaflets along the lower side of this leaf on your screen, I think you get 18, I believe is what I counted yesterday. So it is clearly more than 12, and that's sort of the magic number that we use. If it's more than 12, it's likely a Eurasian water milfoil species. If it is less than 12, then it's one of the native species. The most common native that we see is northern water milfoil, which you see pictured here on the left with Eurasian milfoil on the right. And you can see a few differences right away. One, the northern milfoil tends to be more singular stems, fairly green and slower growing. The Eurasian milfoil tends to be reddish on the top and branches more profusely near the surface and grows a little bit faster. You can see growing in the exact same spot here. The Eurasian is at the surface, it's producing flowers already, forming more of a bush in the water rather than individual stems. You can also see a difference in the leaves at the bottom of the screen. The northern milfoil tends to have 6, 7, 8 pairs of leaflets on an individual leaf. Eurasian milfoil usually having the 13 or more. Curly leaf pondweed is another common one. It's been here for over 100 years, probably introduced through multiple methods in the past, including when common carp were intentionally stocked into many Wisconsin water bodies as a sport fish and a food fish. This is an interesting species in that it grows in a different season than what many of our aquatic plants do. It tends to grow from about late September through the end of June. So it is dormant through the summer instead of dormant through the winter like most plants. It doesn't like really warm water. So when the water warms to a certain temperature in the summertime, the plant just decides, I'm going to go dormant now, release some vegetative buds to just lay at the bottom of the lake and then sprout up again in the fall. Occasionally you may see this plant year round. If it's in a cold trout stream or near a spring in a lake where the water is constantly cool, the plant can grow year round. So you may find it there in the middle of summer. And it tends to release these nutrients into the water. As the plant decomposes in the summer, if it dies back, it releases a lot of nutrients into the water at a bad time when you consider algae blooms as an issue. So these nutrients are released into the water is very warm, the sun is intense, algae are very active, and they tend to grab onto those nutrients immediately when they see them. So large algae blooms are a common side effect of having die-offs of curly-leaf pondweed in the summertime. This species is one of about 3 dozen species of pondweeds we have here in Wisconsin, but only one of them, this one, has a serrated edge on the leaf. So it's a very useful indicator of which species it is. A lot of times you'll see the wavy leaf of curly leaf pondweed shown as a very important characteristic, and indeed it is. But if you find a very young plant, the leaves will not be very curly or wavy like the picture on the left. They will be flat like the picture on the right. But you can always use that serrated edge as an identifying feature for that species. A couple other pondweeds that are very commonly confused for curly leaf are these two on the screen here, clasping leaf and fern pondweed, both fairly common species that you probably have seen before. Starry stonewort, Michelle just talked extensively about this one. It is, again, a macroalgae species. It can grow to 6 or 7 or 8 feet tall, so it is pretty big, and it resembles a larger plant or a vascular plant. It does still have the same sort of body plan to it with a central stem and these leaves, or what are called branchlets. It's more of an algae taxonomy term, but you can think of them as leaves around the stem. Tends to be about 3 to 4 inches in diameter, so it's a fairly large plant. And then it produces those bulbils that Michelle talked about before. These are just under the sediment surface, just an inch or two down, and they look like little stars. They're about 1/3 of an inch long as a maximum size, and these produce clones of the starry stonewort plant later in the future. Some of our native species that look kind of similar are pretty much within this group, the Nytela group, or slender stoneworts. This one here you can see is a lot skinnier. Typically the Nytelas are maybe 1 inch to 2 inches in diameter, not the 4 that we saw in the starry stonewort, and they do not produce bulbils in the sediment. Brazilian waterweed is one that we've seen only once, I believe, in Wisconsin, but it was a pretty common water garden and aquarium species for quite a while. It is now on the prohibited list, like many of these species now in my presentation are. This one is a pretty big, robust plant. It grows to about the diameter of a nickel to several times that diameter. And the leaves tend to be in rings or whorls of 4 to 8 and serrated on the edge, just like the curly leaf pondweed was. It looks very similar to common waterweed, and indeed we've had a few false reports of the Brazilian waterweed which have ended up being this, and that's totally fine. This one tends to have leaves in whorls of 3, and the leaves are not serrated on the outside. Plus, it tends to be less than the diameter of a nickel. This is a really, really common species across the state, the country, and the world. All right, water hyacinth and a couple of these other ones I'll be talking about after this one are these floating plants that form these clusters of leaves that float around on the surface. Water hyacinth has these swollen bases of each leaf where it is full of this very large, airy tissue. So it's very buoyant. It contains mostly air, and it allows the plant to float at a very high level at the surface. And then above that swollen part is this very waxy, shiny, dark green blade, which reminds me of the side of a pumpkin. When you look at the shape of this leaf, it's sort of this broad oval shape. And that serves as sort of a sail for each individual plant. They catch the wind, and eventually these clumps will actually break from wind or turbulence in the water. And then the currents or the wind just push a little clump here and a clump there, and it helps them to disperse across the lake. It's a very, or was a very common water garden species because of the showy flowers that you see on the bottom of the screen there. And it produces these long roots underneath that can be several feet long, and they allow the plant to take nutrients directly out of the water column rather than from the sediment. It looks a little bit like our wild calla lily species, but calla is rooted on the edge of the water and then typically sprawls out over the water just a couple feet from the shore. So it is not a floating species. And the flower is way different, as you see in the picture here. It's just this little spike with a white hood around it compared to that very showy insect pollinated flower on the water hyacinth. Water lettuce is another floating plant that forms clusters of leaves again, except that these ones are, the entire leaf is extremely airy and very, very light. You can hold up a whole clump of these things once they're dry anyway, and it hardly has any weight at all. So again, it helps it float very high on the water surface, helps it break up in the wind to be dispersed around the water body. And this is another common water garden species. You can see the roots on the right, just like the water hyacinth, very fibrous, very long. They dangle into the water and take nutrients out of the water column. Yellow floating heart is one that we have found a few times in Wisconsin. This one looks like a tiny lily pad. It's only about 3 to 4 inches long, produces a little yellow flower about the size of a quarter to a $1/2 size, and that sticks a few inches above the water surface with 5 petals, each petal being kind of fringed along the outside. And the leaves tend to be kind of scalloped around the outside. So they've got this wavy appearance along the outside of the leaf. This could be confused with water lilies or maybe water shield. Water shield is a football-shaped leaf that's usually quite slimy and has a pink flower. And then, of course, our pond lilies typically are much bigger than this. There is one species that's similar in size to this, but it would not have the scalloped edge along the outside of the leaf, and typically would be very sparsely growing. It's a rare species. You almost never see large populations of it. And the flower would be more cup-shaped or ball-shaped, sitting right on the surface of the water. The last one I'll talk about is water chestnut. This one is not in Wisconsin. It has not ever been found in Wisconsin yet, but it seems to be moving here from the eastern states. You can see the picture on the top there is one I found in New York at Oneida Lake almost 10 years ago now. You can see 2 big clumps of water chestnut in my hands there with these very long stem dangling down into the water with submergent leaves and roots hanging off of it. The biggest issue with this one is maybe not the invasive tendencies compared to overtaking other plants and things like that, but the fruits that it produces are very, very hard and very strong and very sharp. You can see a close-up of one of the spines that are barbed on the outside of this fruit, and supposedly these things can puncture thin shoe soles. So like flip-flops you might be wearing on the beach, you could step on one of these and it may actually poke right through your sole. So it's a nasty plant, not one that we want to have around here. So we want to make sure that people would recognize it if we do ever see it show up here in Wisconsin. That is it for mine, and we're going to move on to the next presentation now.
Paul, while we're switching to the next presentation, a question that came up was, will the PowerPoints be available to the attendees from this session?
I'm not sure if we're planning on sharing all the PowerPoints, but the recordings will be available. We'll be posting them all to our Extension Lakes YouTube channel within a few weeks, probably. I'd say the beginning of April is probably likely. We have a lot of presentations to get through and archive all these, but again, maybe the PowerPoint slides themselves not available, but the recordings, which will show the PowerPoints as well, will be archived and available.
Thank you. I think we can move on to Peggy now.
All right. Well, hopefully you're seeing my slides and hearing me.
Looks good.
All right. Well, I'm going to follow in a similar pattern as what Paul got us started on, except we'll be looking at invasive species that are animals. You'll see there we're going to start by looking at some small snails, move into a couple of larger snails and a native lookalike to those, move on to talking about some crayfish, mussels, clam, and then wrap up with the spiny water flea. First of all, with our snails, the faucet snail, well, first, in general, when we talk about snails, one of the things that we're going to talk about right towards the top of our discussions of identification is the opening, or how the, if you hold the snail upright with the point up, where's the opening of the snail? Is it on the right side or the left side? So both the faucet snail and New Zealand mud snail are right side opening on the shells, and you can see that in the pictures there. The next thing we're going to look at is the shape of the shell and the whorls or spirals. And you can see on the left side, the faucet snail has 5 to 6 whorls, whereas the New Zealand mud snail has 7 or 8. The New Zealand mud snail, then looking at size, is a lot smaller. That's a definitely indication or distinction that we can make, where the faucet snails might be small up to 1/2 inch in length or height. These New Zealand mud snails are extremely small, an 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch. And you can see there in the picture on the dime, all of those New Zealand mud snail on the dime, not much bigger than the nose of the person on the dime there. So very small. The faucet snails can be light brown to black versus the New Zealand mud snails more in the gray to brown. And the faucet snail, another part of any of the snails that we can talk about is the operculum, which is the covering of that opening. And the faucet snail, you can see distinct concentric rings, like the rings on a tree. So you can see distinct rings on that operculum or opening. A few other things. The faucet snail is a scraper and a filterer, meaning that they can graze on algae on the substrate, scraping that off and eating it, as well as using its gills to filter the suspended algae from the water column. So they can, in that way, really take a lot of the food source for other things out of the water. They can survive in really high densities in nutrient-rich waters, especially those waters that might have runoff or human influence. So they can build up in large numbers very quickly. The New Zealand mud snail, a few more things about that. Also, it's a grazer that feeds on sediments and algae. Because of its small size, it can easily hitchhike on gear and equipment. Again, another snail, the New Zealand, also has the operculum, which acts as a trapdoor, closing off that opening to the snail that allows it to survive for lengthy amounts of time in adverse conditions or out of the water. So that does affect how we, our actions that we need to take to control the spread of the New Zealand mud snail. We do not recommend wearing felt-soled boots for any work in the water in our streams, but especially in waters with the New Zealand mud snail, felt-soled boots are extremely hard to decontaminate. Remember this picture of the dime and how small the New Zealand mud snail are. So think about getting every speck of mud off your boots to make sure that no New Zealand mud snail that was from samples that were collected in 2011 and 12. So that was our first find in Wisconsin. They are often in our very high quality cold water streams, which is a really big concern in terms of the New Zealand mud snail getting spread. Moving on to much larger snails, are mystery snails. The Chinese mystery snail has a smooth shell. It's larger than the banded mystery snail. The Chinese mystery snail, up to 3 inches tall, has deep grooves between the whorls, which you can see in the photo there. The Chinese mystery snail was brought to California in the late 1800s. So unlike many of our other invasives that are relatively new to the United States, relatively being 20, 30, 40 years, Chinese mystery snail brought here in the late 1800s, most likely as a food source, and then spread to the eastern United States even by the early 1900s. Again, another snail that has an operculum, and you can see the there in the picture of the Chinese mystery snail, a little better view of that. The banded mystery snail, not as large, but still much bigger than the 2 snails that, that we were talking about on the previous page, 1 to 1.5 inches tall, another right-hand opening snail. And you can see from the picture, the bands, the horizontal brown bands on this snail makes it a very desirable aesthetic, snail for aquariums. And that's how it was probably spread, was through illegal release, bought to be in aquariums and then spread through illegal release. The snails, the banded mystery snails are very voracious eaters. They can outcompete our native snails for food and habitat, but they also spread disease and parasites to the wildlife that eat them. So another issue with having these invasives. So finally, what's the mystery behind mystery snails? They are said to, the females can mysteriously and abruptly give birth to live, fully developed young. And that's one of the reasons how they got the name mystery snail. A lookalike, the brown mystery snail, which is a native, it has a little bit more of an olive green shell. Its width to height ratio is smaller than the Chinese or banded mystery snails, meaning it is less squat and more of a tall columnar sort of shape than the 2 that we talked about in the earlier slide. Moving on to crayfish, we have a couple of aquatic invasive crayfish that we do find. The rusty crayfish, quite well known around the state, found in many of our counties, large up to 5 inches in size, and gets its name from its characteristic, very distinct, the rusty brown spots on each side of its hard shell. The rusty crayfish came from Ohio River Basin, probably transported by anglers who had been using the crayfish for bait. Besides its rusty brown spots, it also has black bands on its claw tips. It has very large claws in comparison to other species, and the claws are smooth. If you look closely in that picture, you can see the smooth claws compared to the red swamp crayfish, where you can see the dark red color, but also the raised bright red spots on the red swamp crayfish, on the claws as well as its body. The red swamp crayfish originally is from the Gulf Coast of Florida around to Mexico, originally not a native, but originally found in Florida around the Gulf Coast and over to Mexico. The red swamp crayfish can tolerate brackish water, which is somewhat unusual for crayfish. And also it can cross dry land, sometimes up to miles of dry ground, and then burrow into the ground to sustain itself during dry periods. Definitely looking for those bright red spots covering the body, and then also occasionally a black wedge-shaped stripe on the top of the abdomen. Our lookalike native crayfish is the White River crayfish. Again, a dark red body, but can be brown with mottling, long, narrow claws, and a really interesting and distinct piece or part of the identification of the White River crayfish is that when the claws are closed, they fit completely tightly together, so there's no space between them. It almost looks like one complete claw rather than two separate ones. Going on to a couple of mussels. The zebra mussel and the quagga mussel. Zebra mussels can be up to 2 inches in size, but usually they are under 1 inch in length. In both cases, the mussels are small in themselves, but they form clusters or clumps that cause issues for boating, swimming, fishing, and especially industrial water pipes, intake pipes, rigging, and anything that's in the water that they can cluster around. They cause billions of dollars of economic impact in those types of cases, especially in industrial water pipes. The zebra mussel is flat and symmetrical. It has a much more D shape rather than the rounded or fan shape of the quagga mussel. You can see them having the yellowish or brownish shells in the picture, and then the alternating light and dark stripes, giving them their name, the zebra mussel. The quagga mussel, again, the fan shape. The two halves are asymmetrical, and the really narrow brown concentric stripes are pretty distinct on the quagga mussel. The zebra mussel is a bottom-dwelling clam native to Europe and Asia. It was introduced in the Great Lakes in the 1980s, 85 and 86, most likely in ballast water in ships. Currently found, this is the zebra mussel, currently found in nearly 300 lakes and rivers, lakes and rivers in Wisconsin. The quagga mussel, also coming from the Great Lakes, found in Lake Erie in 89, and now well established in all of the lower Great Lakes as well as the surrounding rivers. Again, the quagga mussel, even more so than others, is that extreme feeder, eating up food sources of fish and drastically changing ecosystems. One other interesting fact, the ventral side or the bottom of the quagga mussel, where the two halves of the shell come together, it is convex, which makes it topple over if you were to try to stand it up on a flat surface, compared to the zebra mussel, which you could actually stand up on a flat surface and it would remain upright. The Asian clam, we say it has ridges, it has raised concentric rings on the shell, and that is a really distinct piece that makes it much more easy to identify. So if you hold the clam and you run your thumbnail over it, you can actually feel the raised concentric rings of that clam. It is small, light in color, also has a blue inside color, which makes it distinct as well. Voracious feeders, the Asian clams are, outcompeting other mussels and juvenile fish. Like zebra mussels, excuse me, yeah, like zebra mussels and quagga mussels, the Asian clam forms those clusters and can have large economic impact on our water plants and other industrial water pipes by clogging the pipes. And then we have a native lookalike, the fingernail clams. Again, small, think about the size of a thumbnail, maybe up to an inch, but really usually no larger than 3/4 of an inch. So think about the size of your fingernail or your thumbnail. A very fine concentric ring pattern. And if you look at the hinge where you can see distinct teeth, on the Asian clam, you do not see that on the fingernail clam. A very smooth outer surface as compared to those concentric rings that I mentioned on the Asian clam. And lastly, let's wrap up with the spiny water flea. Arrived in the US in the 1980s, discovered in Iron County, Wisconsin in 2003, in Vilas County in 2007, and in the Madison chain of lakes in 2009. So fairly new compared to some of the others that we've been talking about, other than probably New Zealand mud snail. small, very small, 1/4 of an inch, translucent, has a distinct long tail. It's actually a spine, and also a distinct dark eye. So they can easily go unnoticed individually, but again, they gather together in masses on fishing lines and boat anchor ropes, and that's where we can see them more easily, and they begin to really cause problems for us. So to wrap up, I just want to acknowledge the resources that I used in this presentation, some websites, DNR websites, a couple others there, and also the Wisconsin Aquatic Invasive Species Early Detector Handbook, which is a Citizen Lake Monitoring Network handbook that Paul has put together. So I want to acknowledge that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. And at this point, we can switch over to our final speaker, Ann Pearce with the Wisconsin First Detector Network. Go ahead, Ann.
Great. Good morning, everybody. So we're going to.
Ann, I'm going to interrupt you real quick because we're seeing your presentation screen.
Yep, I see that.
Yep.
Let's see. Is that better?
For me, it's looking a little off scale. I don't know how it looks to others.
Yeah, I see about half the slide. It's showing just the left half. Oh,
That
that
looks
looks
good.
fine.
Okay, well, we'll just stick with this and then hopefully somebody will let me know if if it looks funny again.
You're good right now.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe and Paul. So we're going to move back to plants now and start moving kind of towards the shoreline and up out of the water for the rest of the session today. So I'm going to go through, similar to Paul, a handful of plants, some of which are pretty common in Wisconsin, some of which are new higher priority species. On each of my slides in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a map that shows whether that species is restricted, so orange map and the letter R in the state of Wisconsin, or whether it's prohibited. So our restricted species are those that are fairly widespread already. We certainly would love to hear about it if you have them, but the prohibited species, which there will be a few of those, are high priority species. If you think you found them or know you found them, it's definitely great for you to send in a report to your local aquatic invasive species coordinator, or really any one of us that are presenting here today. So we're going to start with flowering rush. As the name suggests, it's a rush that flowers. So it's most easily identified when it's in bloom from about June through August. You'll see these pinkish whitish flowers and three-sided leaf stems. If you're looking for kind of other characteristics to confirm this plant, maybe it's not flowering, maybe you want to double check, you'll see at the root of the plant, there's these kind of onion-shaped bulbils that form on the roots as well. And you can see from the distribution map, this has been kind of found in scattered locations across Wisconsin. And this is one that you'll definitely see in the water. It can grow either as an emergent plant or submergent. If it's completely submerged under the water, you won't see it flowering. There's a few groups of species that might get confused with the flowering rush. So our Burr reed species and Bulrush species sometimes can also have that three-sided stem. If you take a look at these pictures when they're flowering, though, these other groups of species have these very spiky flower heads, much different from the kind of pinkish, whitish petals that you see on the flowering rush. Next up is yellow iris. This is pretty easy to identify when it's in flower, those bright yellow flowers. Another plant that's restricted, and we've got reports of it kind of across the state. This one blooms fairly early in the year, so take a look at your shorelines starting in about April. Down here in southern Wisconsin where I am, maybe a little bit later up north as your ice goes out. The flower stalks on this one can grow up to 4 feet tall, so they can get pretty tall. And they've got broad sword-shaped leaves. So when they're not flowering, there are several species that they might get confused with, including the native blue flag iris, which is going to be its closest lookalike, but obviously the blue flag has a more purplish flower color. And then our cattail species and our sweet flag species. So again, easiest to identify this one when it is flowering early in the spring and summer. Speaking of cattails, we have both native and invasive cattails here in Wisconsin. And generally the way to differentiate them is to look at the male and female flowers. And so on our cattails, the male flowers are kind of on the top of the stalk and the female flowers are kind of that sausage shaped structure on the cattails. And with our native cattails, generally there's no gap between the male and female flowers. On our non-native cattails, of which we have a handful of species, there's typically a gap between the male and female flowers. Now we're seeing from some genetic analysis that this isn't always true, but for most of us, it's kind of a good rule of thumb. And today we're going to just focus on one of our invasive cattail species, the graceful cattail, which, as you can see in the upper right corner, is a prohibited species. So this is one that if you think you have found it, we definitely want a report of it. So far, it's only been found in a handful of places in southeastern Wisconsin. But generally, this is just a very compact, tiny cattail compared to most of the cattails that we're familiar with. So I really want you to take a look at the picture on the right and compare the size of that flower structure to that person's hand, just to notice how compact that is. And this one, you'll see that gap between the male flowers on top and the female flowers below, and that gap can actually be pretty large, up to 2 inches. So if you see what is a seemingly tiny cattail, definitely let someone know. Moving on to a species that probably most people are familiar with by now, we'll take a look at purple loosestripe. So this is a wetland plant that loves to have its feet wet, but we also see it a lot on our roadsides in those wet ditches. So it's a perennial herbaceous plant, but as it gets older, the stems can feel pretty woody. If you get a close look at this plant and can feel it, the stems are ridged. They have 4 to 6 sides, so you can feel those ridges on the stems. And then they have opposite leaves, as you can see in the picture on the bottom. Sometimes there will be a whorl of leaves originating from that same point on the stem as well. And this one starts blooming kind of later in the summer, July into September, and you're going to be looking for these dense spikes of kind of magenta colored flowers that typically have 5 to 7 petals each. Purple loosestripe also has several native lookalike species. Here are just a few. I would say, especially for those of you in northern Wisconsin, fireweed is likely to be the one that's most easily confused with purple loosestripe. I like to botanize while I'm driving down the highway, and I think later in the summer, I have to do a double take to check and see if that pinkish plant in the ditch is loosestripe or fireweed. Fireweed has a similar structure, and the flowers are a similar size. Each individual flower is a similar size to purple loosestripe, but you'll see that that flower cluster is a much looser, more open structure. And then these other species can get confused with loosestripe. Blue vervain has those spikes of flowers, but the individual flowers are very tiny, and the color of the flowers is more purplish or blue compared to the more magenta color of purple loosestripe. And there's some of our blazing stars that have a similar color, but I mean, these fringy petal structures on the blazing star are much, much different from purple loosestripe. Up next is lesser celandine. This is another prohibited species, so one that we definitely want to hear about if you think you found it. It's a spring ephemeral plant, so it blooms, starts coming out pretty much as soon as the snow melts. So pay attention to, as your shorelines start getting uncovered from snow and ice, start looking around for this plant. It's a ground cover, so it doesn't grow very tall, and you're going to be looking for kidney-shaped leaves that are glossy and dark green. And sometimes they're kind of scalloped around the edges, as you can see in the picture at the top that has several flowers in it. The edges aren't always scalloped like that though. But the flowers, bright yellow, kind of that buttercup color. And each flower stalk is only going to have a single flower on it. And then at the base of the flower, if you look at the picture on the lower left, there's 3 green sepals below the flower. So that's one characteristic you can look for to differentiate this from other species. And then the other things you're going to look for on lesser celandine are in this middle picture, bulbils, which are these kind of whitish spherical structures. They're a reproductive structure that's produced on the stems of the plants. and then tubers, so kind of those potato-like structures on the roots. And the bulbils and tubers are both reproductive structures. So even though this is a spring ephemeral and the leafy green part of this plant will die back certainly by June, these reproductive structures allow it to keep spreading and get carried away in the water throughout the season. So this is a pretty big concern along our riparian areas. We do have our native lookalike, the Marsh Marigold. So another spring ephemeral that I know lots of us look forward to seeing each spring. It's got similar colored, bright yellow flowers, grows in similar areas, blooms at the same time. So what you're going to look for to differentiate the celandine from marigolds, but the Marsh Marigold is generally a larger plant, and each flower stalk typically has 2 to 5 flowers on it, instead of the single flower that we'll see on lesser celandine. The Marsh Marigold doesn't have those green sepals, so if you turn over the flower head, you won't see the green sepals below. And then it also does not have those bulbils or tubers, so those reproductive structures.
And you have about 4 minutes with this session.
Okay. Up next is butterfly dock. So this is, we found this in a couple new places this year. Basically, if you see something that looks like giant rhubarb leaves growing in a wet area with a big flower stalk coming out of it, good idea to let somebody know. The flowers do emerge before the leaves in the spring, but as you can see on the right side photo, the flower heads with the seeds will remain standing when the leaves arrive as well. We also have our knotweeds. There's 3 knotweed species in Wisconsin. This is another one that's probably pretty familiar to people. Grows definitely along riparian areas, but kind of getting into that more upland area as well. To look for big arching plants with smooth stems that are hollow and these alternate spade-shaped leaves. And then it's easiest to spot late in the summer when it has the plumes of tiny white flowers kind of popping up from the stems. And just to mention that we do have the 3 species. So Japanese knotweed is the smallest, giant knotweed is the largest, and then Bohemian knotweed is a hybrid of the 2. So it's kind of got in-between characteristics. But they all generally look the same. And it's a good idea to kind of map where any of these are. It doesn't really matter what species, they're all managed the same. Up next is another species that's pretty new to the state. It's called golden creeper, or it's also known as red hailstone, based on the fruit that it produces, which there's a picture of that in the lower right corner. This is a member of the cucumber family, but it's a perennial vine that has lots of tubers that it grows from. And that picture on the bottom kind of center, you can see a riparian area that's just been overtaken by golden creeper because the tubers tend to spread in flooding events. So this one, you're going to look for hairy, heart-shaped leaves that kind of have that rough texture of cucumber leaves. And then it blooms throughout the summer, kind of July into September, with numerous 1-inch yellow flowers. Now, golden creeper does have separate male and female plants. And to this point, we've only seen male plants in Wisconsin. So we don't expect that people would see these red fruits because those would only be on the female plants. But definitely if you see a vine like this with lots of yellow flowers, particularly along roadsides or in riparian areas, we definitely want to know about it. All right, and then moving on to stilt grass. This is a species that was found for the very first time in the state last year in La Crosse County. It's a species that's very widespread in the eastern United States, so we suspected it would pop up first in southeastern Wisconsin, but turns out we got fooled and it was in western Wisconsin. So this is one we suspect is in more locations than we realize at this point, but it's a pretty small annual grass with a really weak root system. But the leaves on it are pretty distinct because they're asymmetrical. So one side of the leaf tends to be a bit more rounded and one side tends to be a bit more flat. And then if you look at the picture on the left, it has that kind of shiny, silvery stripe down the middle of the leaf. And this one can grow up to 3 feet tall, but generally you see it kind of as a spreading mat along the ground in moist forests or along riparian areas. So there are some lookalike species in Wisconsin. A few other grasses that it can get confused with. The white grass or Eurasian species often grow right next to the stilt grass. Very similar growth habit and habitats, but the white grass won't have that silvery rib or stripe down the middle of the leaf. Crabgrass, the flowering structure, kind of 3 spikes of flowers, looks similar on crabgrass and stilt grass, but again, the crabgrass leaves grow in much more dense clumps with stronger roots, and they don't have that stripe. And then some of our smartweed species actually do kind of have a silvery stripe down the middle of the leaf, but they're not grasses, and so their veins aren't parallel going straight up and down the leaf, as you'll see on our grass species. And then the smartweeds tend to have kind of pinkish or whitish flowers. So if you see it in bloom, it'll be easy to tell it apart from the stilt grass. So that is it.
Thanks so much, Anne, and to all of our speakers, Paul and Peggy. We have used up the entire time for this session. So those of you who have been posting questions, you may have seen that Paul jumped in and started typing answers, and I believe he's answered every question you all posted into that Q&A box. So if you posted a question or just want to review them, pop over to the Q&A box and you'll be able to see the questions and the answers from Paul, and he's provided some links and some really good information there. We are now entering a short break. The next presentations will begin at 10 a.m. The next presentation in this session on aquatic invasive species will include Say It, Then Spray It, Challenges and Successes of Implementing a Countywide Watercraft Decontamination Ordinance, followed by 2,4-D degradation in lakes following whole lake applications. So during this next 15-minute break, stretch your legs, move around, and consider visiting the exhibitor and sponsor booths in the virtual event space. We'll reconvene here at 10 a.m.